the interpretation of it. I know he's going to be getting feedback on how I do with it, so here goes. In the fall of 1953, I was living with my widowed grandmother, Mary Dubois Peltier, originally from Canada, my sister Betty Ann, and cousin Pauline Peltier. I was 9 years old. Betty and Pauline were 6 years old. We lived in a log cabin made into 2 rooms on what was known as the highest hill in the res that Grandpa Alex Peltier had built in the late 40s. Grandpa had just passed away from pneumonia around November or December of '53. This was on the Turtle Mountain Little Shell Band Native Nations in Belcourt, North Dakota. On this fall September day when I was outside playing, waiting for breakfast, I could see the road a few miles from our place in this huge cloud of dust that could only be made from a high-speeding car, and I knew the only people that had cars that went that fast was a BIA. I knew that I was supposed to run into the woods and hide. This was normal for us as children. We were thought to be at an early age to run. If the government wouldn't steal us, and we may never be returned. But I was curious and I wanted to see where this car was going so fast. And I watched as if in a trance and hypnotically watched the car drive right up to our dirt driveway. This white man got out and started to talk with Grandma. Unknown to him, Grandma could speak very little English, so she was having a difficult time understanding him. I also could not speak very good English. I had a hard time understanding him. But when I heard the word boarding school, which all native children knew and would become terrified at hearing it spoken, I became scared and wanted to flee into the woods and hide. But I did not want to leave Grandma and her sister. I didn't want to leave my grandma and sister and cousin. All I wanted to do now was start crying and screaming to leave us alone. I could see that this man was getting frustrated and angry as hell because Grandma was not understanding everything he was saying. I was now afraid he would hurt them. Grandma was telling me, let her run and hide in the Chippewa language. But I felt as if I were hypnotized. I could not move and was frozen in place. Finally, Grandma understood that she could be taken to jail. As she cried, she told us we had to go with this man or he would take her to jail and take us anyway. Then Betty and Pauline started to scream and cry, and it ran chills up and down the back of my neck. Grandma kept saying to me that I had to be strong, to be a man and take care of my sister and cousin. Don't let them see you crying or they will punish you. But I didn't want to be a man. I wanted to cry for help. I have not let them see me cry since, even when my father passed and when I was told from my bedside phone call that he had passed away. I still didn't cry. We were being driven at a very high speed, and I could see nothing but a large cloud of dust through the rear window to Belcourt, our main community on the reservation, into the Belcourt schoolyard where we could see the school in the late 40s or 50s. A yellow bus was lined up. Poor Betty and Pauline were still crying and making pitiful baby sounds. Even to this day, I cannot forget those cries. I tried everything to make them stop, but they were so young. I believe today that they couldn't stop crying if they wanted to. The fear on their faces was an image that I've tried to forget. It still haunts me after all of these years. I tried to explain to them that they had to pay attention because what if we could escape? We needed to know which way to get home. That is all I could think of, escaping from these people who had captured us. And we didn't know if we were going to jail or what, as no one explained anything to us except we were going to a boarding school, the thing that we thought to run from and into the woods when our elders used to want to scare us into being good, or they would take us to what had to be a monster. A boarding school was mentioned. That was all I could think about for the next 250 to 300 miles. I just didn't know how I was going to protect my sister and cousin. It seemed as if we traveled all day. I remember we had one stop to use the bathroom at a roadside rest stop. In those days, they were all outhouses. Betty and Pauline would not budge from their seats, and I had to beg them to go to the bathroom. They gave us a sandwich to eat, but Betty and Pauline would not eat, so I had to put the sandwiches in my pocket just in case we could escape. I found out later they would not eat until the following day, and that was only after they seen me in the dining hall. Betty tells me she doesn't remember all of that. I guess that was one memory she never wanted to remember. I know I have tried to forget all those memories all my life. Pauline never fully recovered, and she was put in a mental institution in Grafton, North Dakota for a number of years. until the laws in the late 60s and 70s became more liberal and she was released. They claimed she fell off of cement steps at the boarding school and had a mild case of brain damage. I went to visit her once and could not stand what I saw, and I could never go back, and I regret that now and will until my death. I grew up wondering what crime we had committed, except to be told we were just Indians. We arrived a few hours later at Wampton Indian School in Wampton, North Dakota. I'd say the time was around 2 to 3 p.m. We were all told to line up, and they started to arrange us in age and school grades. I didn't know what grade I was in, so when the kid next to me said third, I said yes, third grade. So we're all lined up in rank and file, age and height, and made to stand in formation like a reformatory school. We were then marched to what became known as the Center Hall. They had east side and west side rooms, all in the basement. On the east side was the laundry, barbershop, clothing issue, and shower rooms. The west side was recreation rooms for the winter months, or when it was too cold or raining to go outside. We were then told to line up before the barbershop chairs, and each one of us had our hair cut into a military buzz cut. All of a sudden, we all looked different and did not recognize the ones we had made friends with earlier, and the younger ones began to cry again, as the older ones as well. We now believed we were the older ones, and we tried to make them stop crying, gave them hugs to be assured that they were still friends. One little guy named McLeod held on to me with all his might and became assigned to me to wash. Make sure he got up in the morning and was in bed at 9 p.m. every night. Got to chow, made our beds, which I did not know myself how, but was taught by the older kids that we had to put military folds at the foot ends. The boys and girls all ate in the same dining hall. We then went to the shower room, but before we got in line, they poured DDT over us to kill any lice, and it burned like hell. Again, the younger ones began to cry. As we got to our turn to get into the shower, since the little guy was hanging on to me, I was told I would have to wash him and instructed how to use what I later learned was the same type of soap and brushes used to scrub our concrete floors. The soap and brush to scrub behind our heels and forearms, elbows, and private parts with a washcloth. Vaseline was applied to our forearms, elbows, and heels of our feet. And with a white towel, they would rub those areas, and if any dead skin came out, those of us responsible to wash someone would be struck with a thick school ruler next to the matron, who would be doing the hitting. Some of the older kids refused to hit any of the little ones. They were called the troublemakers. We called them the resistors, the warriors. The ones who would beat up the little ones, we called them the BIA Indians, the Cellos, the white man's Indians. We had a lot of names for them. At this first shower, I got my first taste of this ruler because the little guy started to cry when I scrubbed and washed him too hard, and they found dead skin on the back of his heels. So I quickly joined up with the resistors and hated the matrons and tattletales. We then went to the laundry section where issued big overalls like farmers used to wear and brown work shoes, and were given bed assignment. It was then time to eat supper or dinner, and we were as hungry as hell, and I couldn't wait, as I was told I would be able to see Betty and Pauline again. Earlier, I was called and taken to the girls' dormitory and told I had to make Betty and Pauline stop crying. I explained to them that I couldn't stay, but I was just right next door. And if they didn't stop crying, they would punish me more, and showed them what they did to my hair and the still visible red marks on my back. So please don't cry anymore. I'm not going to leave you. Please. We are going to eat soon, so I will see you at dinner time. When we went to chow, I seen Betty and Pauline sitting there at assigned tables with their heads down, and every once in a while, Betty would look up, looking for me. She finally seen me and started to yell at Pauline, "There's Leonard," waving excitedly. I smiled and signaled them to eat, so they began to eat. I don't remember them ever crying for me again. The first time I was able to meet with them alone in the schoolyard, I was told that we had to grow up and be strong so that we could escape. It was almost 2 years before I tried to make my first getaway and almost drowned in the Red River. It was spring of the year, and my cousin Daniel Peltier told me he wanted to go home and would I run away with him. The weather was warming up, but I longed for my home, and I was also lonesome for my grandma, as she was the only mother I had ever known or could remember. I told him I couldn't leave my sister and cousin Pauline. They would miss me and start to cry again. But Danny was persistent, so I agreed, and with no money or change of clothes, certainly nothing to eat, we took off, not knowing which was the right direction we would go. We just took off, and And as we got what we thought, of course, was a long ways, we laughed and cheered and danced around to our newfound freedom. Then we came to the Red River, and we seen that ice that was thin and would be very dangerous to cross. Since we could not find any place to cross and we knew we had to get across, we selected the narrowest place we could find and separated to about 20 feet apart. I remember being told by the other kids on the nation how to cross thin ice if I really had to look for what was and listen for the ice. I told Danny, watch for the ice in the cracks, look for the shortest route to the riverbank. If you have to lay flat on the ice, so we began to cross. As we got near the bank, Danny made it and started to laugh in joy. I was probably 45 feet from the bank, and the ice started to crack, and it cracked loudly, and I knew it was going to break. So I tried to slide my feet and make myself even lighter than my 90 pounds. I seen this tree limb from a very young tree hanging over the bank, and I went for it. Just as I got there, the ice gave, and I went completely under the ice cold water. My hand grabbed the limb, and I hung on and pulled myself back up to where I got my head out of the water. I grabbed another limb and pulled myself out. Danny grabbed my hand and pulled, and I got back on the land. Wet as hell, but alive. After a few minutes, I started to shiver like crazy, as it seemed as the sun had just gone down and it was growing cold fast. So I took off all my clothes, and we wrung them out and wondered how to make a fire as it was growing colder a lot faster. It was getting dark fast too, and I was getting cold, so we wondered what to do next. And Danny said, let's go back. So we thought about it for a second, and we decided maybe it was the best. And we started to walk in the chosen direction and came to a road. We walked for a short distance, and a car came by and gave us a lift back to the school. We noticed that we had not really gone that far and was sort of ashamed of our attempt to run away. So now we had to face the music. We decided to say it was both of our ideas, and we were lonesome for our homes, as we had not seen our parents or no relatives for over 2 years. But since we broke the rules, we still had to receive our punishment. 10 whacks with the ruler on our butts and our hair given another buzz cut. And we had to wear oversized clothing and shoes so people would know we were runaways, and we could not go to the movies in town for a year. That didn't matter anyway, as we didn't have money to buy the 10-cent movie tickets. I was finally able to get out of Wapton after changes were made in Washington, D.C. in 1956. One rule change was that they could no longer keep us there if we had somewhere to go. So now they could no longer hold us there in the summer months for just minor violations of the rules, and so that the employees had a reason for being there and getting a paycheck. And if our parents wanted to come and get us to take us home, so I wrote a letter to my mom, still thinking I was hundreds of miles away, to see if she would come and get us. She came as soon as she got the letter, but could not take Pauline as she was not her child, which was just a couple of days from when I had sent her. Now came another hard part to this. We had to leave poor Pauline, and from what she heard, she cried for days shortly after she was put into an institution. So after 3 years, I was out of boarding school prison. I don't know how much has changed since my days. Some say it is no longer like it was in my days. Some say it is. I know none of my family or children have ever been put in these boarding schools. Yet I know because some families don't care for their children, some boarding schools are needed. But I know my experience with Wapton will be a memory of hell I will take to my death. I've been a resistor to the attempted genocide of my people ever since those days, and for this, I will more than likely die in prison. On February 6, 2015, I will have served 40 years in a federal prison, even after the prosecutor said in 1984 in a high court that the government doesn't know who killed their agents and no proof against me, for there is none. I was sentenced to 2 life sentences to run consecutively. When I was indicted, a life sentence was 7 years. So I have served 5 life sentences in 4 years for resisting genocide against Native people. I am only guilty of being an Indian. So that was a letter from Leonard. When I was talking to Bill Means about doing this conference, about doing this tribunal, I was telling him that when you look back at the boarding schools, it seems like they're setting up our people for prisons or for going into the service, because in the boarding schools, they had to march around, they'd get up to a bell, ask permission to do everything. It just seems like everything was was geared just for our people to go from one institution to the other. And we wanted to make sure that we, you know, that we brought this to light. And what we were talking about is, with the boarding schools, was the start of what we called identity theft. I said in a white man's world, they call identity theft when they take your social security number, they take your IDs, and they take all that. But for us in Indian country, identity theft is taking our culture, taking our language, and taking our spiritual way of life. And they've done a really good job. What we're trying to do is make some changes, and that's why we're having this conference here. In talking to Bill and in talking to Dennis, I said what I would love to see come out of this is a class action suit against the United States government and the churches, because they're the ones who are responsible for all of this. You know, I was reading some of the history. I've not been in a boarding school myself, but in reading the history, I've seen where they put our people to work during the summers and taking the checks that these children made from working to build more schools to punish us some more. You know, so I know that my mother was a product of the boarding school, and she passed away when I was 12, but she shared some of her stories with me, and I know that, you know, it was a very, very hard time for her. She was an orphan the day she was born. Her mother died giving childbirth to her. So she was put in a boarding school at a very young age, at 4 years old, and she just had 2 brothers, so she wasn't raised with her brothers either. So I just want our history to be documented. I want our children to know that we haven't had an easy path to where we are. You know, we've had to fight for everything, and we're still fighting. We still have to continue. You know, we can't stop, and we've got to make sure that when history is documented, it's documented in our words. We have to be able to tell our children, because we're going to be accountable. We need to make sure that history isn't left by the wayside, and that history is now our story.
Right.